Welcome, everyone, to the OnPoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, well, the New Democrats gave a bit more love to their leader at last weekend's NDP confab in Niagara Falls than the Liberals did the week before. But Marit Stiles didn't quite get the number she wanted, and heads rolled.
Ontario continues to roll out primary care reform, as far too many people still don't have access to a family doctor.
A sad and shocking development related to the MPP for Sault Ste. Marie. Chris Scott is ejected from the Progressive Conservative Caucus and now faces charges of assaulting his wife.
And in your column, my column, I'll look at the future of electricity in Ontario.
And I've got a piece up reminding us that once all the dust has settled, maybe these politicians actually can get along better than we think.
And we're also going to talk about the government's ban on speed cameras. It's Friday, September 26, 2025, so let's get to it.
Okay, my friend, a little sugar to get us started. There we go.
Yes.
What is the turbo that you are wearing on your chest today?
So this was a shirt sent in by a viewer, Guy Pattison in Bracebridge, I believe. And this is an homage to the turbo train of CN history in, I guess, the 1960s, or basically... If you are a train fan in Canada, the turbo train is kind of like the Avro Arrow. It's like this extraordinary piece of technology that was ahead of its time. And now in this day and age, when we constantly lament the fact that there's no real high-speed rail in Canada, people go back to the turbo train, which was this, it was supposed to be an extremely fast way to move people from Toronto to Montreal. It's a relic of a bygone era, let me put it that way.
Okay.
But if you're a train fan in Canada, you know and lament the passing of the turbo train.
I'm glad to know that because I never heard of that before. Well, I am today wearing the shirt of James Pliny Whitney, who was a former Premier of Ontario. There have been 26 Premiers of Ontario, all the way from John Sandfield Macdonald to Douglas Robert Ford. Yes. James Whitney was the only Premier to die in office. It happened 111 years ago yesterday, September 25th. He was the first Tory Premier in 33 years. Believe it or not, back in the day, it was the Liberals who were always in power. They had 33 straight years of power, and then Whitney came in and he broke up that Liberal dynasty. There are two policies that he was really well known for. One of them has stood the test of time very, very well. The other one, not so much. We're going to talk about both of them. You remember Ontario Hydro?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so James Whitney and Adam Beck, for there's a statue of him on University Avenue, just south of Queen's Park, they decided, this is obviously more than a century ago, that all of these private, independent, power-generating companies didn't make sense. And they decided they wanted to buy them all up and create one giant electricity generation and distribution company, which became known ultimately as Ontario Hydro.
Yes.
So he's the father of Ontario Hydro with Adam Beck in many ways. The other one, and we do need to talk about this week, because this is the 50th anniversary of the Franco-Ontarian flag, and it's Franco-Ontarian Day and Week here in Ontario. James Whitney passed something called Resolution 17, which banned the teaching of French in Ontario schools. Yeah. That one has not stood the test of time so well. Yeah. But remember, this is a different Ontario a century ago. It's very orange Ontario. It's very anti-Catholic. It's very anti-French. And so this was a policy that was quite popular, unfortunately, at the time. Anyway, interestingly enough, I suspect we try to remember the better as opposed to the worse, because he's got a statue at Queen's Park. Whitney does. There's the Whitney Block where the Premier's office is on the east side of Queen's Park Crescent. And there's Whitney Hall at Victoria College, U of T, which is not too far away either. 111 years ago, died in office, James Pliny Whitney. There we go.
Yes.
Now, out of curiosity, because it was a big, every time I hear announcements like this, I think of you because I know you, as a rabid cyclist, get your dander up when you start hearing announcements about the Premier wanting to ban speed cameras and
bike
do all,
lanes
bike lanes and do all sorts of things that you that you cyclists approve of. But
yes.
Okay, he made the announcement up in Vaughan. What'd you think?
I'm gonna restrain myself slightly here.
Okay.
And so I guess first of all, let's give the listeners the details as far as we know them. The government has announced that it will introduce legislation in October that will ban the use of municipalities using what we call generically automated speed enforcement, or just speed cameras across the province. Instead, municipalities will be allowed in school zones to install you've probably seen them, like big flashing lights, some of which will display the speed that cars are traveling at. There's some evidence to suggest that those can be like effective. Drivers tend to react to those signs as if they're being watched, even though it's just a purely automated a sign. So speed cameras are out. The government says it will make a fund available to municipalities to make changes to roadways. We discussed this last week, that there are ways to change the physical makeup of roads that can slow traffic down. No word on how generous the new provincial funding will be. I would make a bet that it might be millions or perhaps tens of millions. I'm not expecting a lot more than that, and thus I don't expect that to be as effective as the speed cameras that it is replacing. My reaction you asked for is that, I said this last week. I have continued to say this. People, ask me my opinion in the office, on the street, whatever. There are a lot of different ways I would be willing to, acknowledge the nuance of speed cameras and, negotiate things. And I note that there were city councillors in Toronto and elsewhere in the province saying, like, hey, like, there's a lot of things we're willing to discuss, a lot of changes we're willing to talk about making in order to hang on to this tool. On this matter, to put it bluntly, Doug Ford is a fundamentalist. He just wants them gone, and that's it. And that's the end of the discussion, because he and the PC majority in the legislature have decided this is what it's going to be.
Yeah.
And that's within their powers, right? Like, these are provincial highways. Every road in the province, there are actually a handful of roads that are not provincial highways, but that's another topic. But this is entirely within the purview of the legislature of Ontario, and so this is how it's going to be.
I thought you were going to get a little tougher. I thought you were going to say something like, let's not let evidence get in the way of making policy in the province of Ontario. But no, because the evidence shows that when you've got speed cameras up, people tend to slow down because they don't want to pay fines for driving too quickly. And when you slow down, there are fewer accidents, there are fewer people killed and injured. And we would think that's something we want to encourage.
Well, I thought when I referred to the Premier as a fundamentalist, maybe that would be tough enough. But is it a fundamentalist or extremist who won't change their mind and won't change the topic?
Well, there you go. Yeah. I don't know. I drive a car from time to time, not very much, but from time to time, and I can't stand those bumps. Right. They put the speed bumps. I think we called them like sleeping policemen back in the day. I can't stand. I really don't like driving over those things. They ruin your car, and of course they get you to slow down. But I don't know. Seemed to me if you didn't want to pay a fine for speeding, just don't drive so fast.
Yeah, well, and referring to this as a tax grab, right? Like, there is no tax on earth easier to avoid than the speeding fine.
No
right?
kidding.
So I think, obviously, our audience can guess this is not a policy that I'm personally fond of. At the same time, not being a driver, it doesn't actually affect me one way or the other.
Someone's going to challenge this, Someone's going to go to court and they're going to say something like, removing these cameras infringes on my right to be safe because people will drive more quickly as a result. That argument will be introduced in a courtroom in this province, I'm predicting, at some point in the next year.
Well, I think that's very likely, because of course we've just seen the bike lane precedent where that was exactly the argument made, that removing an existing piece of road infrastructure that kept a population safe infringed on that population's right to security of the person guaranteed under the charter. And there's an additional wrinkle here, which is that these speed cameras were not exclusively but frequently used in school zones. And you're not literally forced by law to send your child to a public or Catholic school in Ontario.
French.
Or French, yes, indeed. But it is the heavy presumption, and the vast majority of parents do send their children to some kind of publicly funded school. it's not a matter purely of choice. The government really does pressure you to send your kids into the physical locations of these schools that are now going to be less safe than they were before this change in policy, which is another issue that a court may consider. So I would just offer that to our listeners. I think you're right that somebody will draw on that bike lane precedent and introduce this in court, and we will see what happens.
One other little political observation.
Yes.
They had this news conference in which all of the getting rid of the speed cameras and the introduction of new ideas to keep speeds down were introduced. It was in Vaughan, Ontario, just north of Toronto. Did you notice which mayor was at the news conference?
There were a few, but I noticed
the one in particular that I'm thinking of?
Former Minister of Transportation under a previous government.
Who is now the mayor of Vaughan?
Yes.
Stephen Del Duca, who's now Doug Ford's best friend, even though they couldn't stand each other 3 years ago when they ran against each other. It's funny how things change.
Yes, but of course Del Duca was Minister of Transportation when the earliest iteration of this automatic speed enforcement law was brought in at Queen's Park. But of course both parties, right, like this law was expanded under the Ford government as well. And so in part, Doug Ford is simply reversing the policies of his own government from a few years ago. Kind of a sordid story on that side.
We could go on, but shall we get on to issue one? Let's do it right now. On to issue one. Well, the number didn't start with a 7, but it was pretty close. New Democrats gathered in Niagara Falls last weekend to render their verdict on Marit Stiles' leadership. Unlike Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie, the previous weekend, Stiles got a high enough level of support to keep her job, but not as high as many thought she'd get. JMM, where are we here? I guess 66.9% wasn't good enough for Joe Clark back in 1983, but apparently 68% was good enough for Marit Stiles in 2025.
Yeah, it seems that she has said she will stick around as leader, and we're a few days removed from these events now, so it seems like things are settling. But this was certainly a lower result than I expected. I think we predicted that she would sail through. If this was sailing, it was definitely choppy waters, and it's notably worse than any result that Andrea Horwath received in any of her leadership reviews, including after the 2014 election, which I think most New Democrats really regarded as sort of Horwath's worst performance in the sense of having helped precipitate that election and getting a really disappointing return after the fact.
And Kathleen Wynne sort of outflanked her on the left, which is usually pretty hard to do in this province with the NDP. And yet, yes, she still got in the mid-70s. I think twice she got in the mid-70s for her leadership reviews.
Yes.
Anyway, 68% for Marit Stiles was certainly better than 57%, which is what Bonnie Crombie got the weekend before. But how do we put this? It seems to me that the grassroots of both parties are fairly cranky these days.
Yes.
Expectations by their two leaders were not quite met. And in the case of the Liberals, the leader's head rolled. And in the case of the New Democrats, some other heads rolled. What happened?
Right. So we've seen a bunch of changes in the personnel around Stiles. Two high-level staffers have been they have left the employ of the leader's office, whether they were fired or otherwise. They will be bringing in Jen Hassam of the Broadbent Institute as an interim chief of staff. Also, the provincial director of the party has also resigned. So these are lots of high-level changes in personnel in a relatively short period of time. And I think you could say it serves two purposes politically for Stiles. One is that there's a phrase that you hear a lot in American politics, but personnel is policy, right? The people you hire to do the job are a big influence on how the job will be done.
Clearly.
And so when you need to make a change, and it's very clear that the party membership have signaled to Stiles that she needs to make a change, one of the big changes you need to make is people got to go and new people got to come in. And related to that, but separately, Stiles personally needed to show to the members that she is taking this seriously. And so I think it's important to note that some of the people who were dismissed this week included people who had been with her since the beginning of her leadership run. So these are people who have worked closely with her. I wouldn't speculate about their relationships, but these were close partnerships, and she's saying goodbye to these people. That always in politics comes at a personal cost, right? But it's also how you signal the seriousness with which you are addressing these changes, right? No sacred cows. Nobody is too close to the leader not to be replaced. So I think part of what's being signaled here is that Stiles is really taking this warning from the membership very seriously.
We should do one little postscript as well on the nuclear issue, because you talked about this last week. They had an opportunity, the delegates did, either to indicate sort of more support or less support for nuclear power. What did they do?
The motion passed. So this motion that was being debated by the New Democrats, I believe it replaced prior language in what is called the party's policy book, which is not exactly a platform, but it's a series of policies endorsed by the membership. And the previous language had come initially, I think, going back to the 1980s, the real height of the anti-nuclear movement. And it didn't literally say the NDP opposed nuclear power, but it said the NDP only support nuclear power if conditions X, Y, and Z are met. And of course, these were conditions that would be very difficult to meet, right?
Second coming of Jesus Christ, that kind of thing?
Exactly, right. So this new language that has been passed is much more positive towards nuclear power. I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but it basically says, that the NDP join other major unions in supporting made in Canada, publicly owned, unionized nuclear power, which of course describes very much the status quo in Ontario, that most of the nuclear power in Ontario is operated by OPG, the publicly owned power company, the inheritor of Ontario Hydro, or successor to Ontario Hydro. It is very heavily unionized. One of the interesting sort of aspects of this whole debate has been for a very long time that this is a very heavily unionized sector in a publicly owned part of the economy, and yet the NDP have been very skeptical to it, and that has strained the relations where there ought to have been an easy win for a pro-labor, pro-public ownership party like the NDP. Anyway, so the motion passed. The now official position of the NDP, really, breaking with like several decades now of precedent, is that they support nuclear power and, or at least, support nuclear power with those caveats, again, that it be unionized, publicly owned, and made in Canada. And then what is always an interesting question is, like these motions get passed at party conferences, and then maybe the leader who is responsible for actually running on a platform later at the next election, maybe they don't pay too close attention to every single motion that gets passed at a party meeting. But I get the sense from people within the caucus that they expect this to really change the orientation of the party towards nuclear power going forward.
So I guess the only genuinely anti-nuclear power party at Queen's Park now are the Greens. Right? Everybody else is pro.
Well, and even they have softened some of their language, right? Like we had Mike Schreiner on the podcast. Would have been earlier this year with the election, and and he's accepts the reality that with the refurbishments at Bruce and Darlington largely complete or underway, that some measure of nuclear power will be part of Ontario's energy mix for decades to come.
Some measure? I mean, come on, half, 60%.
Exactly.
I mean, we're overwhelmingly dependent on it right now.
I won't speak too much for him. I would imagine Mike Schreiner would say that, they would love to see renewables grow to shrink the relative size of the nuclear fleet, but he's not going to be dynamiting the Darlington power plant at any time in the future, which seems like a very bad idea as I imagine that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And with that, we're off to issue 2. In the last Ontario election campaign earlier this year, the Liberals tried to make a big issue out of the fact that as many as 2 million Ontarians don't have access to a family doctor. Fortunately for Doug Ford, Donald Trump started to threaten us and the issue never took off. But that does not mean that the problem has gone away. However, the government did have something to announce this week, and JMM is here to give us the deets on that.
Right. So the government is hoping to connect 500,000 Ontarians with a primary care provider by 2029. They are calling for proposals from 75 new or expanded healthcare teams to whom they will provide funding. People might be most familiar with the standard, like, sole practitioner family doctor operating out of their own office. I think for a while now, provincial policy has been trying to move more towards family health teams where you combine multiple doctors, more efficient sharing of resources, that kind of thing. The government is providing $250 million announced this week. This is part of a much larger $2.1 billion that they have already announced in investing in this plan.
And these teams are expected to do what?
Well, part of the call for proposals is exactly this question of asking teams to present the plan that will show how they will attract new patients, particularly in what the government calls areas of high unattachment, which feels vaguely like a dating term.
Sounds a bit like 1984 as well.
Yeah.
High unattachment.
A place of high unattachment. What we mean is places where people don't have access to a doctor either, because the doctor might be retiring, right? There's plenty of small towns where maybe the single or maybe one of only two doctors in the town is retiring, that kind of thing. The government knows that there is a need for primary care, but even regions of the province where there might be primary care practitioners, it's a big old province, particularly once you get out of the GTA. And, some people might just live far away from an accessible clinic or a hospital or whatever. And so part of this planning is trying to match people who are willing to practice in areas where doctors are most needed to those places. This is the second call for proposals the government has announced. The previous round in June announced $235 million for over 130 new and expanded primary care teams. That round was hoping to connect 300,000 people to a primary care provider. So you can see the government is eating away at that number, that 2 million patients. Still, I wouldn't say that we've got a clear line of sight to the day when nobody lacks a doctor in Ontario. But, these are appreciable chunks that we are taking out of the problem. It is interesting to note that the latest announcement provides just $15 million more in funding to fewer care teams. So it will be interesting to see, in general in public policy, it becomes harder and harder to address that last most difficult to solve part of the problem, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's possible that we will see these sums either, get larger to address smaller numbers of patients. That would not surprise me as a public policy matter, but we will see as this goes forward, because I'm quite certain this will not be the last announcement of this kind.
No, for sure. And we should also remind people this is work that emerges from the work done by Dr. Jane Philpott, who was, of course, the federal Liberal health minister back in the Justin Trudeau days, and Doug Ford tapped her to basically lead the primary care reform in the province of Ontario, and she's got this gig for the next, whatever it is, 4 or 5 years.
I think as long as she wants it.
Right, to try and make all this happen.
Yes.
Okay, moving on to issue 3. Well, this was a very tough week for the Scott family of Sault Ste. Marie. It started with a very terse announcement that Chris Scott, the Sault's MPP, was being ejected from the PC Caucus and would henceforth sit as an independent. When journalists asked why, the Premier's office would only say, "Ask the Sault Ste. Marie Police." Turns out Chris Scott has been arrested for allegedly assaulting his wife. Now, before we talk about all this here, we want to remember there is a family at the center of this. There are young kids affected by this, and a marriage that is obviously undergoing some serious difficulty. So we are going to be very circumspect about how we discuss this. So, John Michael, let's start with this. Chris Scott, if he's found guilty, what's he looking at?
To add to all the reasons that you mentioned for circumspection, is that the right word? We'll also add that Chris Scott is, like any Canadian citizen, he is innocent until proven guilty. He is alleged to have committed assault and assault with a weapon. The police have charged him. None of these charges have been proven in court yet. Jail terms for these charges vary from as little as 2 years less a day for a minor charge up to potentially 5 years for more serious offenses. As my law professor in journalism school always emphasized it is very rare for anybody to get the maximum sentence for a crime. So I relay that to our audience. But the 2-year threshold could end up being important in this case. Again, Scott is innocent, until proven guilty. But should he be found guilty and sentenced to more than 2 years for a serious offense like this, Section 750 of the Criminal Code could come into play. This is a section of the federal criminal law that says that anyone who holds public office, which includes members of provincial legislatures, would functionally have their seat vacated.
That's happened before, actually. It happened once, I think, in the 19th century, so it's been 140 years since it happened, but it has happened once before. Anyway, we put all that on the record. In addition, let's put the opposition reaction on the record here, because the New Democrats came out of the gate first, and they demanded his immediate resignation as a member of the Ontario legislature. They did not feel that just evicting him from the government's caucus was enough.
Yes.
The Liberal parliamentary leader, John Fraser, took a different approach. He reminded us, as you have as well, appropriately, that in our system, people are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, and he was content to allow the process to unveil itself before weighing in with any demands. What's your take on these two different approaches?
Well, first of all, I think they're both sincere, right? I don't think that John Fraser is trying to duck a difficult issue here. I think that's just a sincere reaction on his part. But I do think it also reflects the different state that the parties are in. We have one party that still has a leader in place and one party that kind of does not. I mean, Bonnie Crombie is still the leader of the party, but she is laying low, and John Fraser may not feel like he can really speak fully for the party, if I can put it that way, right? Certainly, if I were in John Fraser's position, I would feel some reluctance to get out over my skis about what is a very touchy issue, an issue where, our audience can see how careful we are talking about this issue. And the other thing I would say is that, at least at the moment, in the case of both parties, to be blunt, this is all sort of cheap talk, and it might not be forever.
Got it. I think we should leave the speculation right there and just move on to your column, my column. Okay, time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns that we wrote for our website, tvo.org, over the past week. Get us started, sir. What do you got up your sleeve?
We already talked a bit about nuclear energy, and there is a new report out I should properly call it a technical paper by the agency that does the sort of long-term electricity planning here in Ontario, called the Independent Electricity System Operator, or IESO, in a sector that absolutely loves acronyms. But this new paper from the IESO, if you read it quickly, you would get a sense that they were saying it was now possible, because of changes in technology, for Ontario to get all of its, or almost all of its, electricity needs met by wind, solar, and batteries, and that it could do so without much more expense than natural gas, and cheaper indeed than nuclear power. And this is, in fact, the argument that was made to me by Jack Gibbons of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. When I spoke, however, with people at the IESO, they said, not so fast. It turns out that, as with so much about electricity policy, it is a more complicated story than that. The technical paper doesn't quite say what Jack Gibbons says it does. Jack Gibbons, I did, of course, give him a fair chance to respond to that argument, and people can read all the ins and outs of that in the piece that I wrote for the website at tvo.org. But there is another thing that I wanted to mention. We have at least one fan of this podcast at the IESO, and this is not the first time this kind of thing has happened, but I was in this pretty detailed technical argument about energy modeling, and this director of planning at the ISO happened to mention that A, he lives in Hamilton, and B, the last premier who had to approve a new model of nuclear reactor in Ontario was Bill Davis. And he basically said, checking boxes for our
we go.
podcast here. We've got the Hamilton mention and we've got our Bill Davis mention. And so thank you to anyone who I ever need to talk to for this job and when I'm interviewing people for either for the podcast or the website. If you want to make our job easy by getting the Bill Davis and the Hamilton mentions in, I'm always happy.
I'm always pleased to get those references in there as well. Yes, indeed.
What about you?
Well, I went to something, I don't know, was it the last week or the week before, it was a very sweet event, and it reminded me about the fact that so much of what we see on camera, at question period, at press conferences, so much of the theater of politics is just that. It's theater. It's made-up drama for the purposes of sharing moral indignation about something the opposition is doing or the government is doing, but at the end of the day, these people may not despise each other as much as they appear to be despising each other as they perform their duties. What am I talking about? In the borough of East York, that enclave of the 416 of Toronto, a guy named Justin Van Dett, who's sort of a community organizer, bit of a political activist and, good guy and just sort of does a lot of organizing in the area. He decided to throw a lunch for about 40, I think more than 40, former members of Toronto City Council, going back, as much as a quarter century, even more in some cases. And what's hilarious when you get to these lunches is not how much they're fighting about who was right about what back in the day, because they don't fight about that anymore. What was neat was to see everybody from different political parties representing different ideologies and different values getting together and actually having a very civil, you might even say enjoyable, lunch together and reminiscing about the fact that while we disagreed on this and that, and yeah, maybe we crossed some lines and we were a bit too ornery on this, we were all in the arena together trying to do the people's business as best we could. And it was kind of cool just to see how nice all that was. Yeah. So I got a piece on the website about all of that, and it's a great, I'm going to come full circle here, it's a great reminder that the next time you're watching Question Period, just remember, a lot of this stuff is theater. They don't really despise each other because, with few exceptions, many of them will show up to a reunion 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road, and they'll just be, having a grand time remembering those days when they screamed at each other across the floor of the house, but it really wasn't that bad after all.
There are a handful of exceptions of people
no question.
who legitimately despised each other.
Of course there are.
And those are somewhat legendary, but for the most part, and I think some of this also goes towards the relationship between politicians and the reporters who cover them, that, we are on different teams playing the same game, or at least involved in the same game. And, one has to be careful about, keeping proper lines between like ourselves and the people we cover. But you cannot help but particularly when I was at Queen's Park, more frequently than I am these days. But when I was covering it daily, like you get to know these people, right? And they pull you aside and they tell you a funny story about what happened to them while over the summer or whatever. And it's just it is particularly you get blowback from people on social media about like, why aren't you as furious about X, Y, or Z? And part of the reason that I am frequently not as exercised about one MPP's foibles or another is that, like, I these people, and it's like some of these people, it's just not that easy to get furious all the time.
Yeah. Moral indignation can only take you so far all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we go to the mailbag?
Let's
do that. If you've got a burning question or an insightful comment, we always love to hear from you at this email address, onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, this week's please.
Right, so we've got a question here from Ian Williamson in Ottawa, who writes, Dear Steve and JMM, despite near zero news on the topic, rumor has it that we have about 10,000 Ontario College staff on strike. It makes me wonder why reporters, onpoli included, and politicians don't mention it. I'd sure like to understand what's going on there, both in terms of the lack of coverage and the actual issues at stake, or even just the politics of it. Thanks, Ian Williamson, Ottawa.
Okay, Ian, let's see if we can help you out a little bit here. This is, yes, you're quite right. This is the second week that Ontario's college support staff have been on strike. There's more than 10,000 of them. They're represented by OPSU, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. And what they are hoping for is not strange and unique. It is job security and wage increases. Have you heard that before? Yes, you have. Okay, what else do we need to know here?
Right. So we've talked on the podcast before about the crisis in post-secondary education funding, and it is hitting different institutions to varying degrees. But OPSU's support staff are kind of at the pointy end of this, where in reaction to lower tuition revenues, lower foreign students coming in, colleges and universities are looking at making cuts anywhere they can. So OPSU has noted that cuts have already led to 10,000 job losses, and I wrote about this a bit for the website over the summer. The body that negotiates on behalf of colleges has offered the union $145 million in improved benefits, wages, and job security, but the union says that is not enough to cover its members. They are hoping for something closer to $900 million, obviously a huge gap between the union and the employer. The colleges may simply, arithmetically just not have that money available to them, which means they would then have to go to the provincial government for an increase in their funding. The provincial government, of course, has made some new money available to the post-secondary sector, but as we have addressed before on this podcast, not as much as their own Blue Ribbon Committee had recommended that they make available. So now the latest development is that a provincial mediator has stepped in, is trying to get talks to resume. But, to the question of why we have not addressed this directly on the podcast before, why other news outlets might not have, the Premier was asked about this either, late last week or earlier this week. And, the government's position at the moment is still kind of hands-off, right? In theory, if this goes on, the government could, call MPPs back to Queen's Park and legislate workers back to work. I haven't seen any discussion of that happening so far, but it is within the realm of possibility. Although the last time this government legislated education workers back to work, it ended badly for them.
Yes, I remember that one. Well, how do we put this here? It is interesting what the Premier's office chooses to focus on or not.
Yes.
And we do remember, it was a week or two ago, that the Premier held a very high-profile news conference in which he took a bottle of Crown Royal and tried very hard to dump the contents out on the ground because the company that owned Crown Royal was going to get rid of 200 jobs in southwestern Ontario. This is 10,000 jobs, and we are not quite seeing the same urgency or theatrics, if I can put it that way. Any theories about that?
Well, I mean, obviously, the progressive conservative government has a different relationship between private sector employment and public sector employment. They just, and fair enough, I suppose, right? Like, they want to balance a budget that is still in pretty deep deficit, and they do not see a shrinking public sector as an emergency to be addressed. On the other hand, they are very concerned about a lack of private sector employment, and if things were going so well in the private sector that all these public sector jobs, people might lose a public sector job but then walk across the street and get a job in the private sector, then the government would see that as totally okay. When the private sector is also struggling, that becomes a bit more difficult. Arguably, but a job is a job, right? And, perhaps we should take 10,000 college support staff jobs more seriously. Particularly, by the way, this government has a particular relationship with, blue-collar unionized jobs, right? These support staff jobs, these are not necessarily the...
This is not for future philosophers.
No, this is not like tenured
students.
academics. This is, so you could certainly see another world where there was a different level of attention, different level of urgency paid to this matter. That is not this world.
Ian, thanks for the shout out, and we appreciate you giving us a chance to talk about this, and also for Mr. McGrath to give the email address in case others are so inclined as well.
Once again, if you'd like to talk about content on the show or ask us about content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the OnPoli podcast for this Friday, September 26th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is the vice president of programming and content.
We always like to give a shout out to our crew for getting the studio here up on the 5th floor of 2180, all nice and gussied up for us to step in here and do our thing. So thanks, gang, and until next Friday, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.